Chapter 21. An End and a Beginning. Momo took several seconds to decipher the longer words on the notice board, and by the time she slipped through the gate, the last of the men in grey had disappeared. In front of her yawned a gigantic pit, 80 or 90 feet deep, with bulldozers and excavators around it. Several trucks had stopped midway down the ramp that led to the bottom of the pit, and construction workers were standing motionless all over the place, frozen in a variety of positions. Where to now? There was no sign of the man in grey and no clue as to where he might have gone. Cassiopeia seemed equally at a loss. Her shell did not light up. Momo made her way down the ramp to the bottom of the pit and looked around. Suddenly she saw a familiar face. It was Salvatore, the bricklayer who had painted the pretty flower picture on the wall of her room. He was as motionless as all the rest, but something about his pose made Momo think twice. He was cupping his mouth as though calling to someone and pointing to the rim of a huge pipe jutting from the ground beside him, almost as if drawing Momo's attention to it. Momo wasted no time. Taking this as a good omen, she hurried over to the pipe and climbed inside. She lost her footing almost at once because the pipe sloped downwards at a steep angle, twisting and turning so sharply that she slithered back and forth like a child on a helter-skelter. She could see and hear almost nothing as she hurtled ever deeper into the ground, sometimes sliding on her bottom, sometimes rolling head over heels, but never letting go of the tortoise and the hour lily. The deeper she went, the colder it became. She began to wonder how she would ever get out again, but before she could give this problem any real thought, the pipe abruptly ended in an underground passage. It wasn't as dark here. The tunnel was bathed in a grey twilight that seemed to ooze from its very walls. Momo scrambled up and ran on. Her bare feet made no sound, but she could hear footsteps ahead of her. Guessing that they belonged to the man in grey, she allowed herself to be guided by them. To judge by the innumerable passages leading of her own in all directions, she was in a maze of tunnels that ran the full extent of the housing development. Then she heard a babble of voices. Having traced the hubbub to its source, she cautiously peeped around the corner. She found herself looking at a room as vast as the conference table that ran down the middle of it. And at this table, in two long rows, sat the surviving men in grey. Momo almost felt sorry for them. They looked so woebegone. Their suits were torn, their bald grey heads cut and bruised, and their faces convulsed with fear. But their cigars were still smouldering. Embedded in the wall at the far end of the room, Momo saw a huge steel door. The door was ajar, and an icy draught was streaming from whatever lay beyond. Although Momo knew it would do little good, she burrowed down and tucked her bare feet under her skirt. A man in grey was presiding at the head of the conference table, just in front of the strong room door. "We must economize," Momo heard him say. "Our reserves must be carefully husbanded. After all, we don't know how long they'll have to last us." "There's only a handful of us left," cried someone. "They will last us for years." "The sooner we start economizing," the chairman went on imperturbably, "the longer we'll hold out. I don't have to tell you, gentlemen, what I mean by economizing. It will be quite sufficient if only some of us survive this disaster, Let's face facts. As things stand now, there are far too many of us. Common sense dictates that our ranks be drastically thinned. May I ask you to call out numbers in turn? When the man in grey had called out numbers all around the table, the chairman produced a coin from his pocket. I shall now toss up, he said. Heads means the even numbers survive, tails the odd numbers. He flipped the coin and caught it. Heads, he announced. Even numbers may remain seated, odd numbers are requested to dissolve forthwith. The losers emitted a dull groan, but none of them demurred. As soon as the winners had relieved them of their cigars, they vanished into thin air. The chairman's voice broke the hush. And now, gentlemen, kindly do the same again. The same gruesome procedure was followed a second time, then a third and a fourth, until only half a dozen men in grey remained. They sat at the head of the conference table, three aside, and glared at each other in icy silence. Momo, who had watched these developments with horrified fascination, noticed that the temperature rose appreciably every time another batch of losers disappeared. Compared to what it had been before, the cold was quite tolerable. 6, remarked one of the survivors, is an unlucky number. That's enough, said another. There's no point in reducing our numbers still further. If 6 of us can't survive this disaster, neither will 3. Not necessarily, said someone else, but we can always review the situation if it needs arises. Later, I mean. No one spoke for a while. Then another survivor said, Lucky for us, the door to the time store was open when disaster struck. If it had been shut at the crucial moment, no power on earth could open it now. We'd be absolutely sunk. You're not entirely right, I'm afraid, replied another. Because the door is open, cold is escaping from the refrigerator plant. The hour lilies will slowly thaw out, and you all know what'll happen then. We won't be able to prevent them from returning to their original owners. You mean, said yet another, that our own coldness won't be sufficient to keep them deep frozen? There are only 6 of us, unfortunately, said the second speaker. You can calculate our freezing capability for yourself. Personally, I feel it was rather rash to cut down our numbers so drastically. It hasn't paid off. We had to opt for one course of action or another, snapped the first speaker, and we did, so that's that. Another silence fell. In other words, said someone, we may have to sit here for years on end, twiddling our thumbs and gawping at each other. I find that a dismal prospect, I must confess. Momo racked her brains. There was certainly no point in her sitting there and waiting any longer. When the men in grey were gone, the hour lilies would thaw out by themselves, but the men in grey still existed and would continue to exist unless she did something about it. But what could she do, given that the door to the cold store was open and the time thieves could help themselves to fresh supplies of cigars whenever they wanted? At that moment, Cassiopeia nudged her in the ribs. Momo looked down and saw a message on her shell. Shut the door, she read. I can't, she whispered back. I would never move it. Use the flower, Cassiopeia replied. You mean I could move it if I touched it with the hour lily? Whispered Momo. Yes, and you will, the tortoise spelled out. If Cassiopeia knew this in advance, it had to be true. Momo carefully put the tortoise down. Then she took the hour lily, which was wilting by now and had lost most of its petals, and stowed it inside her jacket. Going down on all fours, she sneaked unseen beneath the conference table and crawled to the far end. By the time she was on a level with the time thief's 6 pairs of legs, her heart was pounding fit to burst. Very, very gingerly, she took out the hour lily and, gripping the stem between her teeth, crawled on. Still unobserved by the man in grey, she reached the open door, touched it with the hour lily and simultaneously gave it a push. The well-oiled hinges didn't make a sound. The door swung silently to, then shut with a mighty clang that went echoing around the conference chamber and reverberated from the walls of the innumerable underground passages. Momo jumped to her feet. The man in grey, who hadn't the remotest idea that anyone but themselves was exempt from the universal standstill, sat rooted to their chairs in horror, staring at her. Without a second thought, she dashed past them and sprinted back to the exit. The men in grey recovered from their shock and raced after her. "It's that frightful little girl," she heard one of them shout. "It's Momo." "Impossible," yelled another. "The creature's moving." "She's got an hour lily," bellowed a third. "Is that how she moved the door?" asked the fourth. The fifth smote his brow. "Then we could have moved it ourselves. We've got plenty of hour lilies." "We did have, you mean," screamed the sixth. "Only one thing can save us now that the door's shut. If we don't get hold of that flower of hers, we are done forever." Meanwhile, Momo had already disappeared into the maze of tunnels. The men in grey knew their way around better, of course, but she just managed to elude them by zigzagging to and fro. Cassiopeia played her own special part in this chase. Although she could only crawl, she always knew in advance where Momo's pursuers would go next. So she got there in good time and stationed herself in their path. The man in grey tripped over her and went sprawling, and the ones behind tripped over them and went sprawling too, with the result that she more than once saved Momo from almost certain capture. Although she herself was often sent hurtling against walls by flying feet, nothing could deter her from continuing to do what she knew in advance she would do. As the chase proceeded, several of the pursuing men in grey became so maddened by their craving for the hour lily that they dropped their cigars and vanished into thin air, one after the other. In the end, only 2 were left. Momo doubled back and took refuge in the conference chamber. The 2 surviving time thieves chased her around the table but failed to catch her, so they split up and ran in opposite directions. Momo was trapped at last. She cowered in a corner and gazed at her pursuers in terror, with the hour lily clasped to her chest. All but 3 of its shimmering petals had withered and fallen. The foremost man in grey was just about to snatch the flower when the other one yanked him away. "No," he shrieked, "that flower's mine, mine, I tell you." They grappled with each other, and in the ensuing scrimmage the first man knocked the second man's cigar out of his mouth. With a weird groan, the second man spun around, went transparent, and vanished. The last of the men in grey advanced on Momo with a minuscule cigar butt smouldering in the corner of his mouth. "Give it here," he gasped. But as he did so, the butt fell out of his mouth and rolled away under the table. He flung himself to the ground and groped for it, but it eluded his outstretched fingers. Turning his ashen face towards Momo, He struggled into a sitting position and raised one trembling hand. "Please," he whispered faintly, "please, dear child, give me the flower." Momo, still cowering in her corner, couldn't get a word out. She clasped the flower still tighter and shook her head. The last of the men in grey nodded slowly. "I'm glad," he murmured. "I'm glad it's all over." Then he vanished too. Momo was staring dazedly at the place where he had been when Cassiopeia crawled into view. "You will open the door," her shell announced. Momo went over to the door, touched it with her hour lily, which had only one last petal left, and opened it wide. The time store was cold no longer, now that the last of the time thieves had gone. Momo marveled at the contents of the huge vault. Innumerable hour lilies were arrayed on its endless shelves like crystal goblets. No two alike, and each more beautiful than the other. Hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of hours were stored there, all of them stolen from people's lives. The temperature steadily rose until the vault was as hot as a greenhouse. Just as the last petal of Momo's hour lily fluttered to the ground, all the other flowers left their shelves in clouds and swirled around her head. It was like a warm spring storm, but a storm made up of time released from captivity. As if in a dream, Momo looked around and saw Cassiopeia on the ground beside her. The glowing letters on her shell read, "Fly home, Momo, fly home." That was the last Momo ever saw of Cassiopeia, because the tempest of flowers rose to an indescribable pitch, and as it gained strength, so Momo was lifted off her feet and borne away like a flower herself, along the dark passages out into the open air and high above the city. Soaring over the roofs in a cloud of flowers that grew bigger every moment, she was wafted up and down and around like someone performing a triumphal dance to glorious music. Then the cloud of flowers drifted slowly, lazily down and landed like snowflakes on the frozen face of the earth. And like snowflakes, they gently dissolved and became invisible as they returned to their true home in the hearts of mankind. In that same moment, time began again, and everything awoke to a new life. The cars drove on, the traffic police blew their whistles, the pigeons continued circling, and the little dog made a puddle against the lamppost. Nobody noticed that time had stood still for an hour, because nothing had moved in the interval. It was all over in the twinkling of an eye. Nothing had moved, no, but something had changed. All of a sudden, people found they had plenty of time to spare. They were delighted, naturally, but they never realized that it was their own time that had miraculously been restored to them. When Momo came to her senses again, she found herself back in the side street where she had last seen Beppo. Sure enough, there he was, leaning on his broom with his back to her, gazing ruminatively into the distance as he used to in the old days. He wasn't in a hurry anymore, and for some unknown reason, he felt brighter and more hopeful. I wonder, he thought, maybe I've already saved the 100,000 hours I need to ransom Momo. At that moment, someone tugged at his jacket and he turned to see Momo smiling up at him, as large as life. There are no words to describe the joy of that reunion. Beppo and Momo laughed and cried by turns, and they both kept talking at once. Talking all kinds of nonsense, too, as people do when they are dazed with delight. They hugged each other again, and passerby paused to share in their happiness. their tears and laughter, because they all had plenty of time to spare. At long last, Beppo shouldered his broom. He took the rest of the day off, of course, and the two of them strolled arm in arm through the city to the old amphitheater, still talking 19 to the dozen. It was a long time since the city had witnessed such scenes. Children played in the middle of the street, getting in the way of cars whose drivers not only watched and waited, smiling broadly, but sometimes got out and joined in their games. People stood around chatting with the friendliness of those who take a genuine interest in their neighbors' welfare. Other people on their way to work had time to stop and admire the flowers in a window box or feed the birds. Doctors, too, had time to devote themselves properly to their patients, and workers of all kinds did their jobs with pride and loving care, now that they were no longer expected to turn out as much work as possible in the shortest possible time. They could take as much time as they needed and wanted, because from now on there was enough time for everyone. Many people never discovered whom they had to thank for all of this, just as they never knew what had actually happened during the hour that passed in a flash. Few of them would have believed the story anyway. The only ones that knew and believed it were Momo's friends. By the time Momo and Beppo reached the amphitheater, they were all there waiting. Guido, Paolo, Massimo, Franco, Maria, and her little sister Rosa, Claudio, and a host of other children. Nino, the innkeeper, and his plump wife Liliana and their baby Salvatore the bricklayer, and all of Momo's regular visitors in days gone by. The celebration that followed, which was as merry and joyous as only Momo's friends could have made it, went on till the stars came out. And when all the cheers and hugs and handshakes and excited chatter had subsided, everyone sat down on the grass-grown steps. A great hush fell as Momo stepped out in the middle of the arena. She thought of the music of the stars and the hour lilies, and then, in a sweet, pure voice, she began to sing. Meanwhile, in Nowhere House, the return of time had roused Professor Hora from his first sleep ever. Still very pale, he looked as if he had just recovered from a serious illness, but his eyes sparkled and there was a smile on his lips as he watched Momo and her friends through his omnivision glasses. Then he felt something touch his foot. Taking off his glasses, he looked down and saw Cassiopeia sitting there. Cassiopeia, he said, tickling her affectionately under the chin. The two of you did a fine job. I couldn't watch you for once, so you must tell me all about it. Later, the tortoise signaled. Then she sneezed. The professor looked concerned. You haven't a cold, have you? You bet I have, replied Cassiopeia. You must have gone too close to the man in grey, said the professor. I expect you're very tired, too. We can talk later. Better go off and have a good sleep first. Thanks, came the answer. Cassiopeia limped off and picked herself a nice, dark, quiet corner. She tucked her head and legs in, and very slowly, in letters visible only to those who have read this story, her shell spelled out 2 words. The end.